we'll just wait a little while till we have more people, give people a bit more time to hop on before we start the meeting.
I said it last time and I'll say it again. I need to organise some hold music for this point.
We do.
In the webinar. All right, we might give it one more minute and then we might kick off because we've got a lot to cover.
We do.
As per last time.
If yeah, any of you from exotic locations, just drop in the chat where you're tuning in from. Give us an idea of where everyone, where you're all located. Oops. Mine just disappeared, Cassie. Cassie. Not sure what I did.
All right, we've got a few people dropping in the chat. Stephen, just message me with what you might need and I can assist with some technical support. I'll just give it one more minute, guys. I think we've lost our moderator. I will just give Stephen a quick call and then we'll kick off in 1 or 2 minutes.
Right. Thank you. Sorry about everyone. That was a glitch on my part. I've turned myself off at the bottom moment. So yeah.
Happens to the best of us, Stephen.
Take control. That was the problem. I was given the control button. No, welcome everybody. Yeah, I see a nice, healthy number of people on tonight from all over Australia. My name is Stephen Stacey and I'm your host for tonight. Yeah, welcome and thank you for tuning into our second webinar in this series as we dive deeper into the topics surrounding soil carbon projects, focusing on understanding emissions, ACCUs, the carbon market and where that market is heading. Here at Carbon Link, we know there is a hunger for good practical information to assist you to make well-informed decisions for your business. And when it comes to soil carbon, we have plenty of runs on the board with over 90% of the ACCUs issued to date. And we speak from 18 years of experience in soil carbon. Once again, we have Terry McCosker with us tonight. Many of you will have heard from Terry before. Apart from founding Carbon Link in 2007, he also co-founded RCS back in 1985, which was independently rated by a government survey as Australia's most trusted farming knowledge source. So I guess we fall into this role quite comfortably, especially if when we're equipped with Terry sitting in with us tonight. Our activity takes us all over Australia, and we genuinely pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders past and present. Repeating from last webinar that an Australian carbon credit is a financial product and therefore falls under the Corporations Act. The information we're discussing is general in nature, and you should seek further advice before acting on information you may hear tonight. So on to tonight's session, we've responded to your feedback in the first webinar, and we'll start with a recap on key terms and concepts. There's a lot of new jargon in carbon farming to decipher, so we'll take a little more time and go over these again. We were also asked to go into scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions in more detail. We'll look again at offsets and insets, what this actually means and how you can achieve both with a soil project. The ACCU scheme is a market mechanism and the ACCU is a financial product. So we're going to hear what the main market levers are and what is creating demand for your precious ACCUs. We have a new term to introduce that after tonight you will start hearing it everywhere, and that is the safeguard mechanisms. Fortunately for us and for you, we have Kelly Smith from the Carbon Market Institute here, and she is going to help us better understand the importance of the safeguard mechanism, and you will see how it completes the circle and the steps that have led to this point in the carbon market. As I said, there is a hunger for good information, and Carbon Link can contribute because we have seen a huge cross-section of Australia, and we've collected over 15,000 samples from all grazing and cropping areas of Australia. Our projects have been issued 250,000 ACCUs and now cover 350,000 hectares. Soil carbon credits take time to produce. We resample after 5 years, and so that 250,000 credits has come from our earliest projects, set up in 2016 and covering just 11,000 hectares. That works out to between 4 and 5 credits per hectare per year, and these projects are now entering their second round of sampling, so we'll have more later in the year. It's very important to bear in mind that ACCUs are issued, say in 2026, will be from projects that were baseline way back in 2021. So if you baseline your project, say in the next 6 months or a year, it will be 2029 and 2030 before you are seeing those ACCUs. So I can't stress enough, if improving soil and landscape health is part of your modus operandi, take a look at the ACCU scheme and see how it can add value and solve problems in your operation. So this is our speakers for tonight, and I've introduced myself and Terry. We've got Santos returning by popular demand. Santos will recap recap terms and concepts from our last webinar and take a fresh look at those using relevant examples to help explain those. And as I mentioned earlier, Kelly Smith is with us tonight. Kelly manages a range of Carbon Market Institute's corporate outreach, research and policy initiatives to build business capacity and facilitate best practice and integrity in decarbonising strategies and market and carbon market engagement. Kelly has previously contributed to design and script writing for university programs, but has spent much of her career working on carbon and energy management plans for industry sites. That's it from me, and now I hand over to Santos to continue.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this second session of this webinar series. After the first webinar, we collected feedback from the attendees and learned that there were quite a few terms and concepts that were not fully understood. For this reason, we are going to do a recap of a few of the topics we covered in the first session and please, if you have any questions while I'm going through it, pop them into the chat or the Q&A so that we can address them in the moment. So starting from the beginning, let's go over what greenhouse gases are. As the name suggests, greenhouse gases are those gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. The main ones being carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide is the most common one and is released through many different aspects of human activity. The main one being possibly fossil fuels. Another term that attendees of the first webinar wanted further clarification on was soil organic carbon, not to be mistaken with soil organic matter. It is the carbon component of organic matter that builds SOC, and it can be stored through photosynthesis and the decomposition of organic matter. Building 1 ton of soil carbon on your property may equal 3.67 tons of CO2 equivalent drawn down from the atmosphere. But what is CO2 equivalent? So let's break that one once again. CO2 equivalent is the metric by which all greenhouse gases are given a carbon dioxide equivalent. By converting everything to CO2 equivalent, we can add them up and compare them directly. As we saw in the previous slide, soil organic carbon has a CO2 equivalent of 3.67, meaning that 1 ton of carbon in the soil equates to sequestering 3.6 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. On the emission side, 1 ton of methane is equivalent to 28 tons of CO2, and nitrous oxide is equivalent to 273. One of the uses of CO2 equivalent, among many, is to account for emissions in just the one metric, compared to, say, having a spreadsheet spit out many different numbers for the different greenhouse gases. Carbon emissions accounting is then the process of calculating, measuring, and tracking greenhouse gases emissions generated from human activity, produced directly or indirectly from business activities within a set of boundaries. To come up with the CO2 equivalent of each greenhouse gas, we use their global warming potential relative to CO2 over a set of time, which usually is 100 years. Carbon neutral means balancing emitted greenhouse gases with equivalent reductions or removals, resulting in zero net emissions. To achieve carbon neutrality, you have to use carbon accounting, also known as carbon footprint, and then offset the measured emissions against verified carbon credits. One type of verified carbon credit is indeed the Australian Carbon Credit Unit, which are issued and verified by the Clean Energy Regulator under the ACCUs scheme here in Australia. There are other examples of verified carbon credits, such as Verra, Gold Standard, and a few others that are more global. Each ACCU and carbon credit represents 1 ton of CO2 equivalent of emissions avoided or removed through eligible projects. Once you get an ACCU, you have the option of selling them, keeping them, or retiring them against your own carbon footprint. Terry will run us through these options later in the presentation. So looking into the ACCU methods, there was also a bit of confusion between the different kinds of methods. To separate them in an overview, there are the sequestration methods and the avoidance or reduction ones. The sequestration ones are those that store carbon in vegetation or soils, such as the soil carbon method, which is the one Carbon Link deals with directly, and also in this category, environmental planting and plantation forestry, among others. On the avoidance side of things, savanna fire management is a common one, where they do cool burnings to avoid the bigger, more higher emitting fires later in the dry season. There's a difference in terms of their permanence requirement because they are sequestration methods. The soil carbon as well as the planting methods need to stay for at least 25 to 100 years, whereas the avoidance don't have a restriction, a permanence obligation. Among the risks, there is risk of reversal, for which the methods account for some discounts on the ACCUs given to the methods of soil carbon, environmental plantings, and so on. Whereas an avoidance method, as soon as they stop operations, they stop crediting. So there's no permanence obligations for them. Looking into co-benefits, there are plenty that come with the sequestration method. More carbon in the land, being in the soil or in the trees, will have improved biodiversity and habitat, improved soil health, water retentions, and plenty others that are directly linked to the productivity benefits as well. So moving into a little bit more detail, to further address that feedback, we'll look deeper into the carbon emissions accounted, specifically on what scope 1, 2, and 3 mean and how they are measured. So
Hey,
before,
Santos, do we just stop there and see if anyone has any questions on those key terms or concepts that we've covered so far? If you do, drop them in the chat now. And we'll keep rolling through scope 1, 2, and 3, but please do ask the questions when they come to mind.
By all means, yes. I know I'm tracking fairly quick through this, so we got a presentation to go through, but at the same time, we are keen to address any doubts on these terms that may seem common to us, but are definitely ones that need further clarification. So feel free to interrupt at any point. In the meantime, scope 1, to put it simply, are their direct emissions, meaning emissions that come from your own activities. Scope 2 are the emissions that come from purchased energy, and scope 3 are the indirect emissions from the value chain, which may be divided into downstream and upstream. Let's break those definitions down and see what they mean from a grazier's point of view in this case, and we'll then compare it to a supply chain. So as I mentioned, scope 1 emissions are direct emissions, in this case from sources owned or controlled by the farm. For example, this includes methane from livestock, nitrous oxide from fertilizer application, and methane and nitrous oxide from manure. Enteric methane from cattle is in most cases the grazier's largest source of emissions in scope 1 that can account all the way from 80 to 95% of all emissions. Scope 2 are the emissions that come from the consumption of purchased electricity, including electricity to power the farm equipment, buildings, sheds, general operations. Scope 3 are indirect emissions as well that occur outside of the farm's direct control, but are still linked to its operations. These are divided into upstream and downstream. Upstream refers to those that happen prior, such as in the grazier's case, the emissions from the production and transport of inputs like fertilizers and pesticides coming into the farm, whereas downstream is beyond the farm gate, so the product leaving. Example can be those related to processing, transportation, distribution of farm products. Of note here, as Stephen put it last time, in the beef supply chains, it's common for cattle to change hands multiple times during their life cycle. So, for example, a calf might be sold by the breeder to a backgrounder, and then from the backgrounder to a feedlot, and finally to a processor. Depending on where you sit within the value chain, the scope of emissions may change. To clarify that, let's now look at a supply chain perspective. In this case, I use McDonald's to keep it in the same line of the supply chain. And the first difference that you may notice in this slide is that the weight of the scopes have changed substantially. The grazier had scope 1 as its highest because of enteric methane from livestock, whereas McDonald's scope 1 is quite low. That is, their direct emissions differ from those of our producers substantially. In this case, their scope 1 will be company-owned restaurants, natural gas, company vehicles, on-site refrigerants, and so on. Their scope 2, purchase electricity, same thing. It's their power bill footprint. By far, the largest category covering all indirect emissions outside of McDonald's direct control is their scope 3, 99.5 of their total. So what is upstream against what is downstream will change depending, and we can have a bit of a further look and break down these two columns. Non-surprisingly, MACA's upstream scope 3 is the largest component of their carbon footprint. And a bulk of those emissions are coming from beef, chicken, potatoes, and other agricultural suppliers, which sit under the purchased goods in this table here. On the downstream side of things, operations are franchised. Obviously, that's a big reason why they also have a 99.5% on their scope 3 rather than say their scope 1. If they owned all of those restaurants, they would fall under scope 1, but because they're franchise, they're downstream and they're referred to as scope 3 in this case. Again here, so any questions on this, please stop me or I can provide further clarification on it. In the meantime, moving on, inset and offsetting was also introduced last time, and we're gonna give it a little bit more of a look today. Offsetting is compensating for emissions by investing in external projects. So again, using McDonald's as an example, if they bought carbon credits from mangrove restoration in Madagascar, that would be way outside of their supply chain. They buy on their credits to be carbon neutral. On the other hand, insetting in this case for MACAs would be actually investing in their supply chain. So how can I reduce those emissions coming from my beef suppliers, for example? Can I get them to do different kinds of management practices on the land so that scope 3 reduces substantially? When they invest in projects like this, that's called insetting, and it goes directly into reducing their scope 3. If they invest in that, that's it. That's the reduction in scope 3. They cannot then use that reduction of a ton and offset it somewhere else. So that's important to notice the difference between insetting and offsetting. From a producer perspective, I won't go too long into this one because Terry's gonna show a little bit more detail here, but you actually have 3. So you can create, you can generate credits by having a carbon project on your farm, and you can then sell them to different businesses. Insetting, in this case, it would be partnering with MACAs, for example. And lastly, retiring credits against your own footprint would be using credits that you've generated and retiring them against your own, say, scope 1 emissions from your farm. From the supply chain perspective, again, as I said prior, using the same example, offsetting in the case of MACAs would be investing in avoided deforestation in Papua New Guinea. That has nothing to do with their scope 3 or their emissions, whereas insetting in their case would be working with producers in trying to lower their carbon footprint, which at the same time will help MACAs claim that they are reducing their scope 3 emissions. That's it in a nutshell. But please, I urge you to, ask any questions if any doubts were left behind here. If not, in the meantime, we can address those at the end, but I'll pass it over to Kelly that has quite a bit of expertise in that topic.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Stephen, for that kind introduction. And I guess so what I'm really going to talk about now is where the offsetting happens, I guess. So as Stephen said, my name's Kelly Smith and I'm the Net Zero Engagement Manager at the Carbon Market Institute. And for those who aren't familiar with the CMI, we're a unique member-based institute that comprises more than 140 corporate and associate members that span across the economy and the carbon supply chain. As an independent member-based institute, CMI is focused on driving the transition towards net zero. Our mission is to accelerate the use of market-based solutions as well as support best practice approaches to decarbonisation in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Our activities include building capacity and opportunity through inclusive engagement and education, facilitating best practice and integrity in decarbonisation strategies, investments, carbon projects and carbon market participation, as well as developing and supporting policy and regulatory frameworks that align with the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. And while the CMI engages closely with our members, it remains independent from the organisations within the membership seeking to advance positions that ultimately align with those international objectives. So this evening I'm going to provide an overview of Australia's carbon market and then talk a little bit about drivers on both the supply and demand side of that market, as well as offer a cautious forward outlook. So Australia's current policy suite means that we have a strong compliance market and a voluntary market. Compliance markets are the home of the compulsory and regulatory, while the voluntary market is really the home of higher ambition and global contributions. In a compliance market, relevant emitters are legally required to manage their net emissions down to a defined limit or baseline using on-site decarbonisation and carbon credits. In Australia, the compliance market is created by the Safeguard Mechanism and underpinned by the ACCU, or Australian Carbon Credit Unit, and another credit unit called an SMC, or Safeguard Mechanism Credit, which I'll explain further later. Voluntary markets exist outside of this compliance market and are unregulated in terms of demand. The demand here is created by companies with higher ambition who are looking to meet voluntary frameworks, targets, and other verification processes, some of which you might already know of. There are things like if you're going to be carbon neutral certified by Climate Active, set an SBTI or Science-Based Initiative target, or be certified under the ISO Net Zero guidelines. ACCUs or international supply sources can be used in the voluntary market. And while the voluntary market is not subject to the regulated demand drivers like a compliance market, it still requires the use of standardised carbon units that have clear rules regarding creation and the presence of trading infrastructure and registries. I'd also like to say that regardless of the type of market participation, best practice currently suggests that companies have a credit purchasing strategy and conduct due diligence regarding the type of carbon credits purchased. So we're talking markets, and a market, as you all know, needs a buyer and a seller. So often, so you need a buyer and a seller, which I guess is kind of obvious, but sometimes people seem to forget that. So what I wanted to talk about first is that supply side. So the supply side is the seller. And in Australia, the supply side is all about the ACCUs and SMCs. So ACCUs are generated using any one of the 33 published methods, and SMCs are formed when a reformed Safeguard Mechanism facility, again, I'll talk more about those later, ends up below its baseline in any 1 year. You can see from the graph on the left there that different numbers of ACCUs are generated by each different method. And there are lots of reasons why this is, which I won't go into now, because what I really think, although it's small, the much more interesting graph is the one on the right, because what that graph shows you is the price, and it shows you that you get different prices for different sorts of methods. So differences in risk, permanence, co-benefits, and general perception of a method all contribute to price variation, with probably, obviously, again, lower risk, co-benefit rich credits commanding a premium over the lower or perceived lower integrity or higher risk methods. Often the price that you hear quoted is actually what's called the generic ACCU price, which is just a spot price, and it's a spot price where the buyer and the seller haven't stipulated the method. Current concerns on the demand side of the market at the moment include how long it's taking for new methods to be developed and approved, and method sunsetting. The new interim proponent-led model for method development was introduced as a recommendation out of the Chubb review into ACCU integrity to try and speed up method development and approval, but in its current form, these changes don't seem to have really helped. Sunsetting is another concern at the moment. So all methods sunset or expire after 10 years, which sounds like bad news, but the good news is really that if your project is already registered before that retirement date, it can continue under that method for the remainder of the crediting period. You just can't register a new project under a retired method. So that's the supply side. If we then have a look over at the demand side, which is where the buyers live, I want you to notice, and I think it's pretty obvious, that there's a great big blue chunk that grows over time in that graph here. So this is a graph of ACCUs purchased, which was produced by the Clean Energy Regulator. So that big blue chunk, which is labelled Safeguard, is really the biggest demand driver that we have at the moment. And that Safeguard there, again, is code for purchases of ACCUs by organisations with obligations under the reformed Safeguard mechanism. And to help understand the reformed Safeguard mechanism a little better and how we got to this point, I think it's really worth just taking a moment to have a look at the history of Australian, or a potted history of Australian climate policy. So one of the big changes one of the first big changes really in the Australian climate policy landscape was NGERS. So NGERS is the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, which was the first time Australia had a legislated method for calculating and reporting greenhouse gas emissions. And what NGERS required was that any organisation with over 25,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents in a year was legally required to report using the methods as they were written in the NGERS legislation. So this was a really big step forward because it standardised how emissions were calculated and reported. The NGERS calculations cover Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for most greenhouse gas generating activities. Interestingly, it doesn't cover agricultural practices like Santos mentioned before. So there's nothing about cows burping or farting in NGERS to help us out. The next thing that came along though was the carbon farming initiative, which is where some agricultural or the land users start to get involved in carbon policy. And when that was introduced in 2011, then this enabled the land sector to take part in carbon abatement projects. And so this is really where the ACCU was born. So there was also lots of talk at this time around climate and climate policy, but we were still very much in a voluntary space with no clear demand drivers for credits. The next thing that happened there was the introduction of the Emissions Reduction Fund, which was a funny piece of policy whereby the government would buy ACCUs using a reverse auction with a prescribed pool of money to help create a demand driver. 2016 was then our first move towards a compliance-based market, with the first iteration of the Safeguard mechanism coming into force. The goal here was to stop Australia's emissions increasing beyond a business as usual level by placing limits on big industrials. There were many different sorts of baselines or limits applied, making it quite complex. Importantly, the baselines themselves didn't reduce over time and were very generously set, so it was rare for a company to be over baseline. At some point, it was realised that this wasn't very effective policy, and so between 2016 and 2023, there were numerous reviews and changes with the goal to make the Safeguard mechanism more effective. So that brings us to the reformed Safeguard mechanism, which is what we have today, and it was introduced in 2023, with the financial year 23-24 being the first year when the reformed Safeguard mechanism applied. For the majority of cases, the reformed Safeguard mechanism applies a production-based limit or baseline to Scope 1 emissions for facilities which emit over 100,000 tonnes of Scope 1 emissions in a year. Importantly, the baselines actually reduce year on year, and a facility's net emission needs to be at the baseline for the year by using on-site decarbonisation projects and initiatives or purchasing carbon credits in the form of ACCUs or SMCs. So that was a whole lot of words. So what I tried to do is help clarify what that all looks like using a graph, because I tend to think in pictures. So if a facility, like facility A on the left-hand side there, at the end of year one is below baseline, then that's a really good result for them because they can earn Safeguard mechanism credits. And 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent below your baseline is equal to 1 Safeguard mechanism credit. And a Safeguard mechanism credit can be sold to other Safeguard facilities, or you can keep it for use in later years. If like facility B, which is kind of, I guess, in the middle left, there you are, despite your best efforts over the baseline, then you need to purchase ACCUs or SMCs to bring your net position back to your legislated baseline, where the red dotted line is meant to represent the legislated baseline. It's also important to note that the baselines are set on a total position for that July to June financial year. So you can be over or under in any 1 month, so long as it's all sorted out at the end of the year. So the declining baseline means things in year 2 get harder, because for most facilities, this baseline is going to reduce by about 4.9%. So if facility A sits on its hands and doesn't implement any more projects or initiatives through year 2, they will find that they're no longer below baseline, and so they won't get any SMCs in year 2. If they ended up over their baseline at this point, they would have to purchase ACCUs, or they could use the SMCs from year 1 to bring their net position back to meet baseline. But as I've drawn it here, they can sit on their hands just for the moment, but next year is going to look pretty rough. And here we've got poor old facility B, who is even further over their baseline and needs to buy carbon credits, or whether it be ACCUs or SMCs, to bring their net position back to the limit. Interestingly as well, currently there's no limits on ACCU quantity or type used to meet your baseline, but it is the case that if you buy more than 30% of your baseline in credits to get your net position right, then the company essentially gets called to the principal's office and has to write a please explain letter to the minister. So one of my other favourite graphs, and if this was a more interactive forum, I would ask people to guess. But so this is a graph. It says, I've said holdings, but it's actually surrenders. So this is annual surrenders from 2019 of ACCUs, from 2019 through to 2025. So if you had to guess when the first compliance period for the reform safeguard mechanism was, when would you pick? So again, if I could see hands, I'd offer chocolates, but if you picked Q1 2025, then you'd be right. All net positions need to be settled by the 31st of March in the quarter following the end of the compliance period. And so the next thing I wanted to offer was just a very cautious look forward. If you look at the graph on the left, this comes from DQ, and the dotted lines there are can be read as a supply and demand curve, where the blue dotted line is demand, and the yellow or orange dotted line there is supply. And so you can see that supply and demand are reasonably well balanced across time, but in 2030 or 2031, there does appear to be a small supply shortfall. This supply and demand balance, though, is subject to change, because supply has all the challenges we spoke about before, and demand is really just settling into a very new policy. So there's a whole lot of projects and other activities going on that really need to embed themselves to understand that demand curve much better. And of course, again, we come to price, because the supply and demand curve sets a price. And what I've got there is some modelling which was done by Reputex in 2023, which shows prices for both a high and low demand scenario. And you can see at the time the modelling was done, those pricing scenarios are still quite a long way apart. But I think you could say the general view would be that the price will go up, but by how much depends on many, many different factors. And so it's really something that is best if you keep watching and not waiting, but watching and looking to see what's best for you. And with that, I'll hand back over to Terry.
You might be on mute, Terry.
I was on mute. So are there any questions for Kelly or Santos at this stage on? There's one there. What happened?
Yeah, we do have one in the chat. What happens if the net zero by 2050 plan is scrapped?
So the net zero target, so the reform safeguard mechanism and supporting legislation is there to help Australia meet its targets and to help Australia meet its NDCs, so its nationally determined contributions. So currently Australia has a 43% below 2025 levels for its 2030 NDC, and then the government is looking to set a 2035 NDC in September. So the safeguard mechanism legislation was set up to support those particular legislative targets. So if the safeguard mechanism legislation is its own set of legislation, so it's not a mechanical link in that way. So those bits of legislation and policy may come up for review, but exactly how that would play out, I can't tell you that. And are all businesses responsible for scope 1, 2 and 3? So all businesses will have scope 1, 2 and 3. Safeguard mechanism is all about scope 1.
That's
Santos?
it. Yeah, I was just gonna add. All businesses will have a scope 1, 2, and 3. Whether they measure it or not is a different question. So yeah, the short answer is yes. All businesses with activity will have their scopes that can be defined.
I think the question was, are all businesses responsible for scope 1, 2 or 3?
Depends on what you mean by responsibility. But yeah, they will have the responsible of emitting emissions from either scope. Now, in terms of accountability, that is yet to be seen, whether they're going to be held accountable. Yeah, that's it. For their scope 1, 2, and 3. We are seeing, and we covered in the first webinar, some different policy being put into place where organization businesses with over a certain amount of emissions are obliged to report on their scope 1, 2, and 3. And that baseline is also going lower. So I think it's over a certain amount of millions per year are going to have to start this year, and then that goes lower and lower.
There's also an emissions limit on that. You're talking about the mandatory mandatory climate reporting.
Yes.
So there's a monetary trigger, but there's actually also an emissions trigger, and the group 2, I think it's anyone who has an NGERS obligation needs to start doing mandatory reporting. So some of your members scope 1 are very definitely those companies scope 3. And so people will start coming and asking sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Kelly.
Kelly, so that's sort of leading into why this matters now. And so where that was just heading was there is market pressure coming from the McDonald's type end of the market on they're wanting to look at their scope 3s, which is your scope 1s. And so there's going to be certainly interest in firstly, what are your emissions? And the way that's being looked at the moment is in terms of emissions intensity. So that would be kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of beef or per kilogram of grain or per tonne of grain, etc. So there's probably going to be more and more interest in that knowledge over the next few years. And at the moment, that's coming from global trade expectations, because I think our food industry is concentrated in about 10 organisations globally. I think we should be looking at these as well, not so much from, or the ACCUs at least, not so much from the perspective of emissions, but in the perspective of future-proofing for business. If you've got ACCUs in your account and you hit a drought or you hit a lower commodity price period, then you can actually sell those ACCUs and keep your cash flow evened out. And I think they are going to be a great hedge against fluctuations going forward. Also, if you've got ACCUs, you've got opportunities for revenue, and there's a few other things there. The opportunity for some insetting, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, if you've got ACCUs, you've actually then got options. If you don't have ACCUs, firstly, you're going to be struggling to know what your sequestration is, and secondly, you're going to have to understand what your emissions are, but you've actually got nothing to offset against those emissions. So option one is, if you've got ACCUs, you can firstly sell them. That's your first option. You can sell them to emitters, and Kelly's talked about the scale of that market and where that's heading. It's sort of demand there of about 30 million ACCUs a year is where it seems to be leveling out on what Kelly just put up there. So if you're selling to an emitter or one of the, somebody in the safeguard mechanism that requires them, that can be a direct sale, gives you income, price transparent is transparent. You know what they're worth, you know where the market is, etc. And that's a fairly mature, or certainly maturing, part of the market at the moment. So the safeguard mechanism is a way to monetize ACCUs if you have them. Your second choice, again, if you've got ACCUs, is you can retire those ACCUs against your own emissions. So retiring means if I have a ton of emissions and I retire one carbon credit, then that emission is wiped out. So I could want to have a carbon neutral product, and there would be moral reasons why people want to do that. At this stage, there's certainly no economic reasons why you'd want to do it. There's a possibility, and I think in the short term there will be premiums for very low volumes of product, but in the long run there's not going to be premiums whether you're carbon neutral or not, or carbon negative. What there will be potentially is discounts for high emissions or high emissions intensity. At the moment, that market of insetting, so you could just sell these yourself on the open market, and then retire a proportion, and you would be carbon neutral. I'm going to run through some numbers on that shortly and show you the economics of doing that. The next option is inset, in other words, to sell them into the supply chain. Now, to sell them into the supply chain, so if I had 10,000 ACCUs, for example, I've got a choice of selling them to BHP or Rio or somebody like that, or a power station, or I could sell them to McDonald's. Now, provided the price is the same, I might want to help the supply chain by sending them down the supply chain. If the supply chain expects me to donate them, I think that's probably something that's not going to happen in reality. So we'll just look at this in a little more depth in terms of an actual scenario. So on this particular property, the point I want to make here is that we should be putting carbon into soils first and foremost for the productivity and sustainability benefits for our property. The more carbon we get into our soils, the better our productivity will be and the lower our cost of production will become. We'll store more water, as this example shows, and there's a lot of production benefits for it. Also, as you could see, I'll just show you on this how well you can see this, but if you look at that stream there, you can see a brown stream of water coming through there, and that's from the neighbouring property. And just in there is all clean water. And that clean water is coming out of a creek here on this particular property, which is actually managed well. And so there's no soil loss from this particular property. But years ago, there probably would have been. So again, in the bottom left-hand corner there, you can see what some of that landscape looked like some time ago. And that same paddock now, taken a few years later, it looks like that with complete ground cover. Now, that hasn't happened because of rainfall. That has happened because of management. In fact, those 2 years there were very similar rainfall in both years when those photographs were taken. So first and foremost, it's management, and you're going to be managing for productivity on your properties and managing to put carbon in your soils. The next question for you is, do you then want to measure that additional carbon that you're putting into your landscape with the potential then to get ACCUs and use them in whichever way you would like? And that's really probably the question that you need to be asking. And I think what I'd like to do, though, is put emissions of a case study here up against the sequestration. So you can see here that the Scope 1 livestock emissions is 95% or nearly 96% of all the emissions on that property. And there's very minor emissions from fuel and synthetic fertilizers and tillage, et cetera, and a bit of electricity. So they're very minor compared to counting the methane emissions. So if we look at the sequestration in this particular case study, and this is a different one to the one we showed a couple of weeks ago, but it shows exactly the same trends. So the measured carbon change here in CO2 equivalents was 130,000 tonnes of CO2 change was measured. And then we have a statutory discount that is put in there, an equation that the government puts in there called probability of exceedance, which then reduces the amount of CO2 to a probability that we've, at that level there, that's a high level probability, that we've actually sequestered that much carbon or pulled that much out of the atmosphere. So that's what we call total drawdown. So you can see there that there's 118,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide that's actually been drawn down here over a 5-year period. Only 68,000 of that has actually been credited. So that's about half. So in other words, there is significant amount of discounting in all of this, which gets you down to the number of ACCUs that you're going to end up with. And then start comparing your total emissions over a 5-year period to, firstly, the total drawdown, or secondly, the ACCUs. So if we put that into monetary terms, let's just see how that works out. So if I've got 68,000 ACCUs to sell, for example, and the price might be $45 a tonne, that would give me gross of 3.1 million. Now that is gross, and that's before commissions and before cost of production and before baselining and measurements and all of those sort of things. So it's just a gross number. I could sell all of those ACCUs and get 31 million in, take off my costs, and I'd have a very nice little profit. Very nice big profit, in fact. Option B might be that I want to become carbon neutral. So to become carbon neutral, I'd take the emissions and take them off my ACCUs, which would leave me then about 61,000 ACCUs that I could then sell. So I'd be carbon neutral and still have 61,000 ACCUs to sell, which under that option would gross me 2.77 million. So I can sell everything for 3.1, or I can become carbon neutral for 2.7. Now it's an economic question. So the gap between that is about $330,000 difference between option 1 and option B. Now, if the supply chain or the consumers are going to pay me $316,000 more for my product, then I'm at break even on, I can then sell a neutral product and still break even on my income. But the supply chains are saying they're actually not going to pay for carbon neutral, they just expect you to do it. So in that case, it's an economic decision and a moral decision. So if you wanted to be carbon neutral and that was something you really wanted to do, then by all means do it. And that will have cost you $316,000 in opportunity cost to actually do that. It's more than opportunity cost, it's real cash. So that's actually what it comes down to in the real world. Now, in the case studies that we've shown so far, and they're all shown exactly the same thing, Northern New South Wales and Queensland based. As we go further into Australia, into Southern Australia, the numbers and the ratios are going to change because the sequestration is per hectare and the carrying capacity or the emissions are per animal. So in Queensland, where we're carrying, say, 1 animal to 3 hectares, we've got 3 hectares of sequestration and 1/3 of an animal for emissions. But as we move into Southern Australia, we might actually have 2 head of animals per hectare. So we've got 1 hectare of sequestration and 2 animals of emission on that hectare. And also, if people in the south are using a lot more fertiliser and particularly nitrogen, then their emissions are going to go through the roof. So these ratios don't hold everywhere, but they certainly give you an idea of what's possible if you have ACCUs and you're looking at your options. So just to finish off, where's the future? Regen Ag is at the centre of everything. So changing management practices, whether it's grazing, whether it's cropping, whether you're horticulture, you're growing trees, whatever it is you're doing, is changing the way we manage the land to put carbon into the soil is the number one thing we should be doing. Then we've got some options. So do we then monetize that carbon that we're putting in the soil? And that's a choice. You may want to or not want to go down that track. But if you've got those that monetized, then you have the ability to start looking at some of these trends. So, you know, there might be local suppliers that might pay a bit more for a product or might be prepared to buy the ACCUs off you. There's potential for partnerships to develop over time where organisations like ACCUs, which they are doing a little bit of this in the US, are actually paying market prices for the CO2 as an inset. So there's, you know, supply chains are probably wanting more to move to insetting, but that's actually going to be determined by the farmers, because the farmers are the ones here who actually have the whip hand. You are their scope 3 emissions, but you are also have the ability to sequester a lot of carbon, and therefore what you do with that is up to you. So there's a number of things there that are starting to trends that are happening. So how should we think about this? And I think that, you know, I think you've got to remember that if you've got ACCUs, then you have power as a producer. You're not going to be pushed around in terms of what the supply chains want. You have the choices. If you don't have ACCUs, and there's a lot of landscapes where that's not possible, and even scales where that's not possible, then you must be measuring your emissions, understanding what they are, doing what you possibly can to lower those emissions. My advice is to do your homework. Don't listen to some of the sound bites that are around. There's a lot of people that are producing a lot of CO2 at the moment in this space, and it's all coming out of their mouth. That is not necessarily correct when it comes to having to sell your ACCUs, not being able to sell your ACCUs, I should say, in order to cover your own emissions. So we'll pull up there and open up for questions. I think if you want to jump in, you probably just ask straight out.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you just unmute yourself and you can just fire away questions if you wish.
Nothing at all. We must have explained everything so clearly this time.
Well, I hope we did
Great.
actually. That was
Thanks, Kim. We do have one here from, I think it's Andrew Phillip, not Philip Andrew. Just checking on what is the current best option for greenfield sites in Northern Australia? I'm not, can you interpret that question?
Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
that you don't have very many options. Your best option, if you're looking at extensive landscape, is probably the savanna burning method. That can fit in with livestock production. There's actually no regrowth possibilities at the moment, and in parts of Northern Australia, there's in the Northern Territory at least, there is no the government doesn't allow you to sell the credits. So in Queensland, if you produce credits off trees or soil, even on leasehold land, you get approval from the government and you can sell those. That's a lot trickier in the Northern Territory, and in West Australia, you can't sell soil credits off pastoral land in West Australia, but they have opened it up for avoided deforestation credits. So we'll have to account for emissions, but do not have to offset them, i.e. no financial costs for emissions. Richard, it's a financial decision and or a moral one. So if the supply chains or a society is paying you to lower your emissions or to produce a carbon neutral product, then you'll be making up the difference with product, what you get paid for the product. If you don't get paid that for the product, then morally you have I think the obligation for your emissions as much as you possibly can at the moment. But I think getting emissions to zero in agriculture is, it's a ridiculous concept, because landscape has emissions whether you're there or not. If we shut it all up and walked away and took all the animals out of it, the emissions wouldn't actually change. And there's some really interesting data out of Europe recently where they showed that that's exactly what happened, where there was landscape due to a war that was destocked of people and it rewilded. And looking at that sort of 20 years after the humans had left and working out their emissions footprints beforehand and looking at the footprints after, there was actually no change in the total emissions between humans being there or livestock and wildlife being there. So I think that, for example, it's well known in the Northern Territory that white ants, the emissions from white ants far exceeds the emissions from cattle. So I think I think getting your emissions back to a reasonable level is what we all should be doing. Blue carbon. Yeah, blue carbon. I had a talk to some regulators the other day about blue carbon. I think there's one project registered in Australia. Extremely difficult to do. So at the moment, the method is that if you have coastal country where banks had been built to prevent seawater or salt water coming in onto the landscape, and that's identifiable, and you then remove those banks and the seawater or the salt water comes back in, or the tidal water comes back in, it's generally going to be tidal, comes back in the landscape and regrows mangrove, then you have the opportunity for a blue carbon project. There's one of them, and they're very small and potentially uneconomic because of the cost of monitoring on very small scale. Are councils involved to any extent? Not that I've seen. I don't know. Kelly, have you seen much involvement from councils?
No.
Some of them are going to be fairly significant emitters. So from that perspective, they might end up being involved. All Right. Any other questions?
One there from Glenn Terry. Might have to scroll
this one.
down.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, missed them.
I can read it out.
The soil carbon method, what happens when the sequestration doesn't go to plan due to management or weather prior to an audit? Carbon stocks decline. Do you need ACCUs in reserve? And the answer is no. So we've had one project that did not sequester carbon after 5 years. And so we just submitted an offsets report that was a nil sequestration report. That project's coming up to 10 years now, so we will go back and remeasure that again this time round. And they basically will have the ability to say, well, we've not sequestered any carbon, and it's actually only 1 or 2 CEAs within the project, so part of the place has and part of it hasn't. And it wasn't all the fault of the landscape either. Some of it was the very, very first project we ever did. And so there's some things that we got wrong in remeasuring it, which we know how to improve going around the second time or the third time. So if you have not sequestered any carbon and you haven't sold anything, you really don't have any problem. What your loss will be is the cost of 2 measurements, or 3 if you keep going to the third one.
And just to add to that, Glenn, if you go back to Terry's real case study with the green and pink bar chart, there's the regulator holds a lot in reserve. So it's, it just, you roll on to the next sampling round and hopefully do better next time also, because it's not, if credits have been issued, it's a conservative calculation of your total, what you've totally produced.
The other thing I would add that the sequestration I just showed you was done through the 2018-19 drought. I think some of our observations are at the moment that it's not so much drought that's our problem, it's really, really wet years. You're more likely to not sequester carbon or to lose it if you have anaerobic soils due to too much water. All right, any other questions? So if you've got other questions that you think about after this, then by all means give us a call or flick us a message, and we're only too happy to answer those. So Kim, you said yes, we do and have.
That was to approve the blue carbon question, Terry.
Yeah. So what do you mean by that, Kim? Do you have a project, or you unmute, or?
It might be that they have some mangroves.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yep. It could be right. So yeah, if you do have mangroves, yeah, okay. And yeah, so you do have a possibility. You really want to look into the economics if it's only small scale, Kim. But good.
Just letting you know that we you probably will receive a call from us just to get some feedback around your thoughts and some feedback from the webinar. So yeah, please feel free. We respond to those questions as well, and are happy to answer questions that come up afterwards. So yeah, feel free to give your feedback if you do get called.
All right. Well, I think we should call it quits, and it's probably beer o'clock for some of you, although you haven't been sitting there muted and with your camera off having a beer or a drink or a coffee, then it's time you went and had one.
Tongan had one, yes.
Thanks so much, everyone. We'll end it
Thank-
here. Thank
Thank you all.
Yep. No, thanks everybody for coming on tonight, and thanks Cassie and Terry and Santos and Kelly for contributing to a wealth of information. So, and thank you all for giving up your precious time to learn about carbon farming and the ACCUs and all the other acronyms we rolled out tonight. Signing off.